Maybe if you'd learned medicine this century, Nurse Walsh, we wouldn't need to waste time correcting your mistakes. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 47 minutes before the woman he called outdated saved a Marine general's life for the second time. Cedar Creek Medical hums at 2:33 a.m. with fluorescent buzz and antiseptic sting. The cardiac wing stretches quiet as a tomb, monitors beeping their lonely rhythm, ventilators wheezing like tired lungs. Margaret Walsh moves through the hallways with hands that never shake. 62 years old. Grey hair pinned tight. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. She checks vitals on the general in room for 47 manually, ignoring the digital readouts, her fingers finding his pulse with the precision of a surgical laser. One hand on his wrist. Counting. Not rushing. The general's eyes track her movement but don't focus, his consciousness still swimming in the murk of sedation and trauma. His left forearm rests above the white sheet, and there on the inside of his arm is a tattoo in faded blue ink, Walsh. He has no idea the quiet nurse standing beside his bed is the Master Chief Petty Officer who carried him 3 miles through enemy fire with a sucking chest wound. The rain hammered down like applause that day in Marja, 2010. She was different then, younger, ranked higher, known by a call sign instead of a first name. Now she works the night shift at a hospital in Houston, and her only connection to that life is the pair of worn combat boots sitting at the bottom of her locker in the break room. Margaret scrubs whisper as she moves to document his vitals on the paper chart, not the electronic one. Manual observation. Cross-check every number. She's monitoring this patient for signs of neurological compromise from a stroke that shouldn't have happened, a stroke that looked too precise, too calculated. The doctors called it a transient ischemic event. She called it a mission, and blowing her cover meant mission failure. The general's blood pressure is 168/94, slightly elevated. His pupils are equal and reactive. His grip strength is returning. These are facts that matter, and she writes them down with a hand steady as bedrock. The break room door swings open and Dr. Whitfield enters like a man who owns the building. His white coat is pristine. His tie is silk. His voice carries the kind of authority built through 15 years of board connections and carefully managed optics, the kind of power that comes from knowing exactly which administrators will return his calls and which board members owe him favors. He's 47, handsome in a sharp way, the type of surgeon who believes medicine is a hierarchy and he sits at the top. He doesn't notice Margaret initially. She's background noise to him, part of the furniture, the old lady in scrubs who has been haunting these corridors for so long that nobody bothers to look at her anymore. But then he sees her updating the general's chart manually, pulling numbers from her own observations instead of trusting the monitors, and something in his chest tightens. She's questioning his orders. Wordlessly. Which is somehow worse than if she'd said anything out loud. Whitfield moves to room for 47 during morning rounds at 6:40 a.m. with 20 residents trailing behind him like ducklings. His entourage fills the doorway. Margaret is just finishing her vitals check, her fingers still on the general's wrist, reading his pulse the way some people read books. She doesn't acknowledge Whitfield's arrival. She simply notes the time and moves to step back from the bed, but he's already positioning himself center stage, already launching into his narrative for the residents. This patient, Whitfield says, gesturing toward the general with the casual authority of a man who has never had to earn respect because he simply took it, has benefited from modern cardiac monitoring protocols. 24-hour digital surveillance. Real-time data analysis. The kind of precision that separates contemporary medicine from. He pauses, letting his eyes find Margaret, letting them rest on her for just long enough to make his point, outdated nursing practices from a different era. The residents laugh. Not all of them, but enough. 20 voices. 20 people in white coats who haven't yet learned that the person you dismiss today might save your life tomorrow. Margaret makes a note on her clipboard. She doesn't look at Whitfield. Her jaw tightens almost imperceptibly. The trembling wasn't fear, it was restraint, and she adjusts the 4 line on the general's arm with a precision that suggests she could do this in her sleep because she probably has, in more countries and worse conditions than anyone in that room could imagine. In my experience, Whitfield continues, addressing the residents but still looking at Margaret. Nurses of Nurse Walsh's generation learned their craft in an era before evidence-based practice. Before we understood that manual vitals checks are not only inefficient but frankly dangerous. They introduce human error into a process that should be automated. Margaret sets down her clipboard. Her movements are economical. Nothing wasted. She's heard this before, this particular flavor of dismissal, though the uniforms and accents change. She's been underestimated by captains and colonels and doctors who believed rank was the same thing as competence. She doesn't argue. Arguing would be like a submarine surfacing in enemy waters just to complain about the weather. Instead, she turns to leave the room, but Whitfield isn't finished. He never is. "Perhaps, Nurse Walsh," he says, his voice the kind of smooth that makes your skin crawl, "if you'd learned medicine this century, we wouldn't need to waste time correcting your mistakes." The general is stable because of the technology in this room, not in spite of outdated observation techniques. The residents nod. The general's monitor beeps steadily. And Margaret Walsh walks out of room for 47 with her head level and her hands unclenched, leaving Whitfield with the satisfaction of believing he's won something. But that wasn't the worst part. 20 minutes later, two interns stand at the vending machine in the break room arguing about whose turn it is to buy coffee. They're young, 26, maybe 27, with the kind of exhaustion that comes from 30-hour shifts and student loans they'll spend the next decade repaying. One of them is recounting Whitfield's rounds, and he delivers the punchline the way comedians deliver punchlines, with timing and emphasis. "Maybe if you'd learned medicine this century," the first intern says, mimicking Whitfield's tone perfectly, and both of them dissolve into laughter. The second intern wipes his eyes. "I mean, she probably learned during the Civil War, right? She's got to be what, like 70? At least, the first one says. Probably fought in it." They are still laughing when Whitfield walks past. He doesn't tell them to stop. He smiles. It's the smile of a man who has just confirmed what he already believed, that Margaret Walsh is beneath them, that she is a relic, that calling out her obsolescence is not cruelty, it's education. Margaret is not in the break room. She's not anywhere near it. But if she had been, if she'd heard those voices and those jokes, the only sign of it would have been the briefest pause in her movement, the smallest shift in her breathing. She doesn't cry in bathrooms. She doesn't rage in supply closets. She doesn't need anyone to validate her worth. That validation came a long time ago, on a mountain in Helmand Province, when she carried a bleeding Marine through a minefield while calling in air support with his radio and saved 47 lives in the span of 90 minutes. She goes to her locker instead. The break room at Cedar Creek Medical is utilitarian, grey lockers, a refrigerator that smells like someone's forgotten lunch from 3 weeks ago, a microwave that hums its constant complaint. Margaret opens her locker and there they are, the only personal items she keeps at work. A photograph of a niece in a college graduation gown. A water bottle. And at the bottom, wrapped in a canvas bag, a pair of worn combat boots. The leather is cracked. The laces are frayed. The soles are worn to the point where you can see the metal reinforcement underneath, and there's sand in the grooves that she's never quite been able to clean out, sand from the compound in Marja where everything went wrong and somehow went right anyway. She reaches down and touches the toe of the left boot, just brushes it with her fingertips. The leather is cold. Real. Proof that that life happened, that she was someone else once, someone with rank and authority and a team that would follow her into hell. She closes the locker quietly and goes back to her rounds. The general is still in room for 47, still recovering from his stroke, still wearing her name on his forearm like a brand. He doesn't know she's monitoring him for signs of neurological compromise. He doesn't know this was no accident. He doesn't know that the woman who just checked his vitals for the third time in 5 hours is the person who saved his life once before, in a life that both of them have supposedly left behind. Margaret checks his pupil reactivity. Equal. Responsive. She asks him to squeeze her hands with equal pressure, and he does, and the strength is returning, and the neurological picture is improving, and that's good. That's what she wanted. That's the mission. But Whitfield is already on his phone, already making calls, already activating networks that Margaret doesn't know about because she's been out of the game long enough to forget that losing once doesn't mean losing permanently, and people like Whitfield don't lose gracefully. They don't lose at all. The cardiac conference room at Cedar Creek Medical smelled like antiseptic and fresh coffee, the kind of sterile morning that promised nothing good. 20 residents crowded around the projector at 7:15 a.m., their badges clipped to their pockets, their attention fixed on Dr. Whitfield as he pulled up patient charts on the screen. Margaret stood at the back of the room, her grey hair pinned tight, clipboard held against her chest, and watched the blade come down. "Here we have a perfect example of what not to do," Whitfield announced, his voice carrying the measured confidence of a man who had spent 15 years building an empire out of other people's doubt. He gestured at the projector where Margaret's patient notes filled the screen, meticulous handwriting, timestamps precise to the minute, vital signs logged every hour. Nurse Walsh apparently believes technology is optional in a modern cardiac unit. A resident smirked. Another took notes. Manual blood pressure checks. Manual pulse oximetry. In 2024. Whitfield shook his head as if addressing children. Perhaps she learned nursing during the Civil War. Perhaps she believes the machines in this hospital are decorative. The laughter came fast, the kind of laughter that spreads like contagion when permission has been granted from above. Margaret's jaw tightened, just once, a muscle flickering beneath her skin, and then her face went completely blank again. She wrote something on her clipboard. Her hand was steady as surgical steel. Whitfield continued, moving closer to the projected image, pointing with a pen that looked expensive and unnecessary. When physicians write orders, nurses execute them. They do not question. They do not override. They certainly don't waste time with outdated practices that slow down our efficiency metrics. He turned to face her directly, and Margaret felt 20 pairs of eyes turn with him. "Wouldn't you agree, Nurse Walsh? That deviation from protocol undermines the entire team." She met his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Her expression remained unchanged, not angry, not defensive, not submissive. Empty. The kind of emptiness that comes from people who have stared at worse things than a surgeon's contempt. Then she looked back down at her notes and wrote another line. "I'll take that silence as acknowledgement," Whitfield said, turning back to his audience, his confidence restored. Competence in medicine requires respect for hierarchy. We cannot have well-meaning but outdated practitioners second-guessing physician decisions. It creates chaos. It creates liability. He clicked to the next slide, moving on as if Margaret was already forgotten, but she wasn't forgotten. She was being documented. Every patient note, every manual check, every moment she didn't immediately comply was being collected and filed away in a place she couldn't see. 2 hours later, at the vending machine on the 3rd floor, Margaret heard the voices before she saw the residents. 2 interns, both in their mid-20s, both confident in the way that only comes from having never truly failed at anything. "Civil War nurse," one of them said, his laugh like a bark. "Probably used leeches in her last hospital. Maybe bloodletting. That's cutting edge for her generation." Margaret passed them without breaking stride, moving like water around their ignorance, her scrubs whispering soft against the tile floor. Her right hand formed a fist, a perfect, compact fist that had once held a rifle steady through a 9-hour sniper position, that had once applied a tourniquet in zero visibility, that had once carried a 200-pound general 3 miles through enemy fire. She held that fist for exactly 2 seconds. Then she released it and kept walking. That afternoon, at 3:19 p.m., Whitfield found her outside room for 47. The general was resting behind the closed door, his monitors displaying the steady rhythm of a man recovering from something that should have killed him. Whitfield stood close enough that Margaret could smell his cologne, something sharp and aggressive, something that cost more than she made in a week, and his voice dropped to the register he used when he wanted to be heard by her alone. "If you continue undermining physician authority, I will have security escort you from this building. Do you understand, Nurse Walsh?" She nodded once. Her voice came out level, professional, precisely what he expected from someone being threatened. "Understood, Doctor." "You're a relic," he said, and his eyes had the glint of someone who believed the words absolutely. "A liability. And I'm building a case to prove it." He leaned closer, his presence like a predator testing the boundaries of its cage. 3 weeks. That's how long you'll last here before this hospital is rid of you permanently. Margaret maintained eye contact, not challenging, not defiant, just present, and then she turned and entered the general's room and closed the door. Whitfield remained in the hallway for 10 seconds, his jaw clenched, because the absence of a reaction was somehow worse than any resistance. He pulled out his phone and began typing, his thumbs moving fast across the screen, activating networks that stretched far beyond Cedar Creek Medical's walls. Alone in the general's room, Margaret exhaled slowly. Just once. Her hand trembled for exactly 3 seconds, not from fear, but from the discipline it took to remain still while a man threatened her employment, her livelihood, her ability to complete the mission she'd accepted the moment she recognized the name tattooed on his left forearm. She pressed that trembling hand against her thigh until it steadied, and then she checked his vital signs with the same meticulous precision that Whitfield had mocked in front of 20 residents. Blood pressure 118/74. Heart rate 62. Oxygen saturation 98%. Perfect. Stable. Still breathing, still fighting. At 2:38 a.m., Margaret sat at the nurse's station, her eyes fixed on the cardiac monitor for room for 47. The glow of the screen reflected off her face, turning her features into something carved from shadow. She had been monitoring the general's telemetry for 6 hours, and something had changed in the last 20 minutes, subtle at first, the kind of change that machines might miss if nobody was paying attention. The ST segment had elevated slightly. His blood pressure had drifted down by 4 points. His heart rate had climbed from 62 to 71. Margaret pulled his chart and reviewed the notes from Whitfield's last rounds at midnight. No mention of concern. No orders for additional monitoring. No acknowledgement that something was shifting in this patient's physiology, something intentional, something planned. She thought about the stroke that had brought the general to Cedar Creek Medical in the first place, the stroke that had appeared on his imaging without warning, without prior symptoms, without any obvious cause. Strokes didn't just happen to healthy decorated officers. Neither did cardiac complications 3 days later. This was a chain. A progression. Someone trying to finish what they'd started. She stood and moved toward his room, her footsteps silent on the tile floor, her hand already reaching for her stethoscope before she crossed the threshold. The general was asleep, his chest rising and falling in the rhythm of drugged rest. Margaret placed the diaphragm of her stethoscope against his sternum and listened. The heart sounds were muffled, distant, like hearing a drumbeat through thick walls. She checked his jugular veins, distended, full of pressure. Performed a gentle palpation of his chest. The fluid was there, building, compressing his heart like a fist closing slowly around a beating thing. Beck's triad. The signature of cardiac tamponade. Fluid building in the pericardial sac, squeezing the heart, restricting its ability to pump blood. Not visible on most monitors. Not obvious to most doctors. But visible to someone who had spent 20 years keeping broken things alive in spaces where there was no helicopter, no surgical suite, no hospital beds with machines that hummed and beeped and promised survival. She called for Dr. Whitfield at 2:38 a.m., and he arrived irritated, his hair still messed from sleep, his voice sharp with resentment. "This better be critical, Nurse Walsh." "Beck's triad," she said, keeping her voice professional, clinical. Distended JVD, muffled heart sounds, hypertension developing. "I believe he has a pericardial effusion." Whitfield glanced at the monitors, barely looked at the patient, and shook his head with the kind of dismissal that came from absolute certainty. The monitors would show critical changes if there was tamponade. "You're seeing ghosts, Grandma Scrubs. Your anxiety about this patient is turning everything into a problem. An echocardiogram would confirm." "No." His voice had become the kind of quiet that preceded consequences. "You're off this patient. Effective immediately. I'm reassigning you to the 4th floor." Your obsessive behavior is interfering with care. Margaret stood her ground, her voice remaining level, unchanging. This patient has cardiac tamponade developing. Moving me doesn't change the diagnosis. But that wasn't the worst part. Whitfield's face reddened, and he pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumbs moving fast, deliberately slow enough that Margaret could see him typing, could understand that he was documenting this interaction, could recognize the tactical precision of a man escalating a conflict into something institutional and irreversible. Within the hour, Cedar Creek Medical's chief nursing officer would receive a formal complaint. Within 2 hours, the hospital's board of trustees would be notified. Within 3, Whitfield would have activated networks that stretched beyond the hospital walls entirely, calling connections he'd cultivated over 15 years of careful relationship building, people who owed him favors, people who understood that a nurse like Margaret Walsh was a threat to the entire structure of physician authority that their world depended on. Margaret remained at the general's bedside, checking his vital signs every 15 minutes, her hands moving through the ritual of assessment with the kind of muscle memory that came from doing the same thing thousands of times under conditions far more challenging than a Houston hospital in the middle of a Tuesday night. Systolic pressure dropping, 118 to 115 to 112. Heart rate climbing, 71 to 79 to 87. The room was silent except for the soft beep of the cardiac monitor and the whisper of the 4-pump delivering medications that wouldn't fix what was happening inside his chest. She had survived 3 tours through areas where the enemy didn't wear uniforms and mercy was a luxury nobody could afford. She had carried this man through a minefield while calling in air support with one hand and keeping his chest wound sealed with the other. She had watched 40 Marines walk away from a battlefield because she had remained calm when calm was the only weapon available. And now she would watch his heart be crushed by fluid while the man responsible pulled strings in the darkness and called it protocol. 2 in the morning, and the telemetry was speaking to her in a language no one else seemed to understand. Margaret stood at the monitoring station with a cup of coffee going cold in her left hand, her eyes tracking the general's vital signs with the intensity of a sniper reading wind patterns. The numbers were changing. Subtle. The kind of change that would have slipped past most nurses on a 12-hour shift, the kind of drift that gets attributed to equipment variance or patient movement. But Margaret had spent 18 years reading the invisible signals that separated stable patients from those sliding toward the edge, and the general's ST segment elevation told her something was breaking inside his chest. She set the coffee down without tasting it. The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous song overhead as she pulled his chart, the plastic folder cool against her palms. Room for 47. Marine General, admitted 3 days prior with what the admission notes called a suspicious stroke, the kind of phrase that doctors used when they didn't understand what had actually happened. She knew what had happened. She had been there. Marja, 2010. A minefield. His body had been hit, his mind had been stronger, and for 3 miles through enemy fire she had carried his weight while calling in air support with his own radio. They had made it out with 40 Marines still drawing breath. Now she needed to make sure those 40 Marines didn't lose their general to something that had nothing to do with his nervous system. The pressure reading was dropping. Not dramatically, just enough that the machine registered it as a trend rather than an event. 73. 71. The oxygen saturation hadn't followed, but it would. She could see the math unfolding in her head the way other people saw equations on a chalkboard. Blood was pooling somewhere it shouldn't be. The chest X-ray from this afternoon had shown some abnormal density, but the radiologist had called it post-stroke artifact. Margaret had seen that X-ray. Artifact was what you called something when you didn't look hard enough. She walked to room for 47 without hurrying, without drawing attention. The night shift skeleton crew was scattered across the ward, 2 nurses in the med room, an orderly restocking supplies on the opposite end of the corridor, the resident at his computer finishing notes for a discharge that wouldn't happen until morning. Margaret moved like someone who had spent her entire adult life not drawing attention, which was its own kind of performance. She opened the door. The general lay still, tubes delivering oxygen and 4 fluids, the cardiac monitor tracing its green line across the screen in the darkness. His left forearm was visible above the blanket, and there it was, her name, tattooed in military script above his wrist, a reminder of something only two people in the world truly understood. She checked his temperature. Normal. She checked his capillary refill. Slightly delayed. She looked at his jugular veins, watching how they rose against his neck with each breath, elevated, pushing back as if something inside his chest was pressing them from the other side. Beck's triad, they called it in medical school. Hypertension, elevated JVP, and muffled heart sounds. The classic presentation of cardiac tamponade, except the hypertension was just starting and he hadn't made a sound since admission. She bent close and listened to his chest with her own stethoscope, the earpieces familiar against her ears from 1,000 other nights. His heart sounds were distant, as if coming through water, which in a sense they were. Blood was filling the sac around his heart, the pericardium, the space that should have been empty. She straightened up and made a note on his chart, her handwriting steady and precise. Telemetry shows progressive ST elevation. JVP elevated. Distant heart sounds. Possible cardiac tamponade. No physician notation. The words were there if anyone cared to read them. Nobody cared. Nobody had cared about her suggestions for 3 months, and Margaret had learned to document anyway, to leave the evidence in writing, which was what soldiers did. They filed reports that nobody would find until after the fact. Back at the monitoring station, she watched his numbers like someone waiting for a bomb to go off, because that's what this was. Not a surgical emergency waiting to happen, but a detonation in slow motion, predictable as artillery fire if you knew where to look. The general's oxygen saturation began to slip. 98 to 96. His heart rate climbed, 68 to 82. The pressure continued its descent. 70. 68. He was heading toward shock, the cascade inevitable now, the physics of fluid pressing on muscle playing out in real time on the screen in front of her. She should have reported it. Should have called Whitfield, should have triggered the alert system that would have brought the residents running and the attending rushing and everyone moving at once toward the right answer. But reporting meant explaining how she had seen this coming, which meant admitting that she had been watching for the specific failure mode of a pericardial hemorrhage, which meant exposing why she cared so much about this one patient when she was supposed to be just a nurse. Just a nurse who documented vital signs and kept to her lane and didn't ask questions about physician orders. Margaret stayed at the station and watched his numbers tick downward like a countdown, her hand steady on the desk, her breathing measured and controlled. This was the part of the mission that nobody talked about, the part where you knew the attack was coming and you couldn't stop it, only prepare for the moment when you could respond. She had learned patience in deserts and jungles and from commanding men who trusted her with their lives. She could wait. The monitor alarm was a sound like a scream, digitized and compressed, high-pitched and relentless. Margaret heard it from the medication room, where she had moved deliberately to avoid the appearance of being at the bedside when everything fell apart. 4:33 in the morning. The general's heart rate had climbed to 147, his oxygen saturation had plummeted to 72, and his blood pressure had collapsed to 48/36, numbers that meant the pump was failing, the oxygen wasn't reaching his tissues, and he was hemorrhaging internally faster than his body could compensate. She moved before conscious thought caught up, which meant she moved the right way, not rushed, not panicked, but with the kind of purpose that comes from having already decided what needed to happen. Whitfield was on the floor, thank God or curse him, because he rounded at the worst hours when he thought nobody was paying attention to his shortcuts. He made it to room for 47 exactly 3 steps behind her, and 3 residents in mint-condition white coats scattered from their assigned tasks like startled birds. The general's eyes were still closed. His chest was still rising and falling on the ventilator. The monitor screamed its electronic death rattle, and Margaret stood at the crash cart with her eyes on the cardiac needle, a 14-gauge angiocath with a syringe attached, 12 centimeters of steel and plastic that was about to become the difference between him dying and him breathing again. "What are you doing?" Whitfield's voice was already rising, the anger there before the understanding. Margaret didn't answer. She prepped the injection site below the xiphoid process where the rib cage ended and the soft tissue began, the space where a needle could slide between the ribs and into the pericardial sac without puncturing the lungs beneath. Her hands moved with the terrible grace of muscle memory, the way they always moved in the seconds that mattered most. 18 years of civilian nursing, and 12 years before that when her hands had learned to do this in a trauma bay at Naval Hospital Camp Lejeune, taught by a cardiologist who had since become a captain. "You don't have authorization." Whitfield reached for her arm, his face already transitioning from shock to rage, which meant he understood what she was doing but didn't understand why it mattered more than the protocols written in his precious hospital bylaws. Margaret angled the needle at 45 degrees and advanced it slowly, feeling for the grating sensation that meant she had reached the pericardium, the membrane surrounding the heart. His fingers closed around her wrist. "I will have your license." She found the membrane. The needle entered it with a slight give, the way skin gives way to a knife if you know exactly where to cut. The syringe plunger moved backward under her thumb, and dark blood flowed into the chamber, 60 milliliters of it, the exact amount that had been slowly crushing his heart. The monitor's screen dropped in pitch as the pressure released. His oxygen saturation climbed from 72 to 84 in the space of 3 seconds. His blood pressure rose from 48/36 to 72/55, not normal but climbing, trending toward survivable. 90 seconds. The entire procedure took 90 seconds. Margaret withdrew the needle, applied pressure with a sterile gauze pad, and documented the time in his chart while Whitfield's face cycled through colors she didn't have names for. He pulled out his phone. His hands were trembling. "You just performed an emergency pericardiocentesis without physician supervision." The patient was dying, Margaret said, and her voice was different now, lower, steadier, the way it sounded when commands were being issued to people who understood that following orders meant the difference between standing at a grave and standing at a homecoming. "Now he's not." Whitfield walked into the hallway. She could hear him dialing, could hear the rage in his voice as he demanded the board president's home number, could hear the words beginning to flow out of him like poison. "I don't care what time it is. I need to report a serious breach of protocol." A nurse, Margaret Walsh, employed in ICU, performed a physician-level procedure without authorization. "I have 30 witnesses. I'm filing a formal complaint with the Texas Board of Nursing right now." The general's oxygen saturation was 92 now and climbing steadily. His heart rate had dropped to 98. His blood pressure was 110/60, normal, perfect, the numbers of someone who was going to survive the night because a woman in scrubs had remembered that in the space between following rules and saving lives, there was only one choice that mattered. Margaret stood at his bedside with the cardiac needle in her hand and realized that she had just destroyed the only mission that mattered to her, the ability to stay invisible, to watch from the dark, to protect him without anyone knowing he needed protecting. And then the phone on the nursing desk began to ring. The cardiac needle was already in her hand when she moved. Not thinking. Muscle memory. 3 years of training compressed into 9 seconds of pure motion. The sac compressing his heart, pericardial tamponade, classic presentation, blood filling the space where only fluid should be, required a needle at precisely the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. She didn't hesitate. She didn't announce herself. She simply went. The needle slid through skin and muscle and membrane with the faint resistance of a sigh. Her hands were steady as surgical lasers. The monitor screamed its distress call, blood pressure collapsing, oxygen saturation falling through the floor, the general's body shutting down one system at a time. Whitfield stood frozen 3 feet away, his mouth opening and closing like a man trying to speak underwater. The residents scattered backward. Nobody moved to stop her. Nobody dared. The first draw of blood came back dark and thick. 60 milliliters of it, pooling in the syringe like crimson mercury. Each milliliter released meant 1 milliliter less pressure crushing the heart muscle. The monitor began its climb. 95. 102. 108. His blood pressure stabilizing. His oxygen creeping back toward normal. The general's body responding to the space Margaret had carved for it to live. She withdrew the needle with the same economy of motion she'd used to insert it. 90 seconds. That was all it took. The general's monitor found sinus rhythm. Steady. Strong. Alive. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Whitfield's face went white. Not pale. Not worried. White, like someone had switched off the blood supply to his brain. His hands came up slightly, fingers spread as though he might grab something to steady himself. Margaret was already moving away from the bedside, setting the needle and syringe on the crash cart with the precision of someone placing a weapon in an armory. She didn't look at him. She didn't acknowledge the way his entire body began to shake with something that looked like rage barely contained behind his teeth. "You performed a procedure," he said. His voice had lost its surgical baritone. It cracked like a teenager's. "Without authorization. Outside your scope. You violated every protocol. The general is stable." Margaret's voice was flat as concrete. She pulled off her gloves. One hand, then the other. The latex snapped like a whip in the sudden silence. "His tamponade is resolved. His vitals are normal. His oxygen is adequate. That's not the point." Whitfield's face was transforming now, the initial shock crystallizing into something darker. His jaw tightened. A muscle in his temple began to twitch. "You undermined my authority." "You?" He didn't finish. Instead, he turned on his heel and walked out of the room. The residents parted for him like water around a stone, their eyes darting between Margaret and the door, unsure what they'd just witnessed. Nobody spoke. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. The monitors beeped in their measured cadence. The general lay sedated and unaware that his life had just been saved twice, once 3 years ago in a desert called Marja, and once 30 seconds ago in a hospital room in Houston. Margaret knew. The moment she'd made the decision to use that needle, she'd known it was over. Whitfield didn't forgive challenges. He didn't accept being wrong. And she had made him catastrophically, publicly wrong in front of an audience of his own residents, people who watched him, who reported to him, who understood now that his carefully constructed authority was just theater. The laminate holding his power together was beginning to crack. What she didn't anticipate was how quickly he would move. By 7:15 a.m., Whitfield was in his office with his phone in his hand, calling the hospital board president at home. The conversation lasted for minutes. Margaret learned later, from Torres, the security guard with the Navy anchor tattoo, that Whitfield had described her as a danger to patients, a rogue nurse who'd attempted a procedure requiring surgical credentials, someone operating outside any legitimate scope of practice. By 7:38 a.m., a formal complaint had been filed with the Texas Board of Nursing. By 7:45 a.m., Whitfield's medical school mentor, a prominent cardiologist named Dr. Pierce with connections to the state medical establishment, had received a detailed email marked urgent and confidential. The hospital board convened an emergency meeting at 9:27 a.m. Margaret was called to the administration office at 8:55 a.m. and placed on immediate suspension pending investigation. She sat in a plastic chair outside the boardroom while voices filtered through walls that were thinner than they looked. She could hear Whitfield's voice, pitched high with conviction, describing her actions as insubordination, as dangerous, as a violation of physician-nurse hierarchy that threatened the entire structure of hospital safety protocols. She could hear the board president responding, his tone shifting from skeptical to concerned to something that sounded like resignation. At 11:03 a.m., the door opened. The board president, a man named Harrison with thinning hair and the exhausted expression of someone who'd been forced to make a hard decision, asked her to step inside. The room was cold. There was a window that looked out over Houston, the city sprawling beneath them like a collection of decisions nobody had wanted to make. "Your actions this morning," Harrison began, "were outside your scope of practice. Emergency pericardiocentesis is a physician procedure. The patient was dying." Margaret's voice didn't waver. His heart was being compressed by fluid. The physician was frozen. "I had a needle and a dying patient. I used the needle." "That's not how we operate here," a woman on the board said. She had a nameplate that read Dr. Chen. "Even if your intention was good, the violation is clear. You performed a procedure without authorization." "He's alive." Margaret looked directly at her. He would be dead if I hadn't done it. Which is exactly why this is so complicated, Harrison said quietly. You saved his life. But you did it by breaking every protocol we have. We can't have other nurses thinking they can bypass authority structures whenever they disagree with a physician's judgment. The termination letter was printed and placed in front of her at 11:41 a.m. Gross violation of medical protocols. Insubordination. Performing procedures outside scope of practice. Effective immediately. She was given 15 minutes to clear her locker. Security was already waiting when she opened the locker room door. Torres. He was a quiet man, maybe 55, with forearms that suggested he'd served in a capacity that required more than just watching hallways. His eyes met hers for one long moment, and she saw the recognition flicker there, something about her hands, or the way she moved, or maybe something else entirely. He didn't speak. He just walked beside her in silence while she collected her things. The combat boots were at the bottom, wrapped in plastic and pushed far back where nobody would see them. Worn leather. Sand still embedded in the seams despite 3 attempts at cleaning. The soles had been through Kandahar province, through the Hindu Kush mountains, through 4 separate firefights in a place called Sanjan Valley that Margaret had never discussed with anyone and would never again. She held them in both hands, the weight of them familiar and terrible. Torres saw them. His eyes narrowed slightly. His jaw tightened. But he said nothing. Some recognitions don't require words. The exit path took them back through the corridors where Margaret had walked for 7 years. Staff members stared as she passed. Some looked away. An intern she'd trained whispered something to a colleague. A nurse she'd helped during a difficult labor smiled sadly and looked down. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical prayer. The air conditioning pushed cold air that smelled of antiseptic and regret through every hallway. Whitfield was waiting at the main entrance with 2 board members, including Dr. Chen. He had his hands clasped in front of him in what he probably thought was a posture of authority. His face had returned to its normal color, but something in his eye suggested he was still running on the adrenaline of victory. You had potential once, Nurse Walsh, he said as she approached. His voice was steady again, surgical again. In control. But you couldn't accept your place. This hospital has a hierarchy for a reason. Margaret looked at him. She didn't blink. She didn't speak. She simply walked past him, the combat boots still in her hands, their worn leather catching the afternoon light coming through the hospital's tall windows. She pushed through the automatic doors into the Houston heat, and the temperature difference hit her like a body blow. 94 degrees and climbing. The sky was the color of bleached bone. She got in her car, a 2009 Honda Civic with 187,000 miles, and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes with the engine off. The general was still in there. Alive. Vulnerable. And she could no longer protect him from whatever had caused that stroke. Her mission had failed. The invisibility that had kept her effective was gone. She was no longer the nurse people didn't think about. She was the rogue nurse who'd violated protocols. The career nursing assistant who'd overstepped. The woman who'd forgotten her place. She drove to a diner on the south side of Houston, a place called Sal's that served coffee in chipped ceramic cups and looked like it hadn't been updated since 1987. The parking lot was nearly empty. She sat in a booth by the window and ordered coffee. The waitress, a woman with gray hair tied back with a rubber band, didn't seem to recognize her. That was fine. Recognition was the last thing Margaret needed. It was 3:07 a.m. when she was still sitting there. The coffee had gone cold hours ago. The diner had closed at midnight, but the owner, a man named Sal who'd served Margaret coffee on 1,000 different nights, had let her stay. He was mopping the floor near the kitchen, working around her booth without comment. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in shades of clinical white. Margaret's reflection stared back at her from the dark window, a 62-year-old woman in civilian clothes, no uniform, no mission, no purpose waiting for her. Just a nurse. Just someone who'd been fired. She wondered if saving one life twice was worth losing the ability to protect him from what was coming. The general was vulnerable now. Whoever had caused that mysterious stroke, and Margaret was certain someone had, certain it was no accident, would know that he'd survived. Would know he was recovering. Would adjust their plans accordingly. And Margaret wouldn't be there to see it coming. Wouldn't be there to intercept it. Wouldn't be there. Her right hand began to tremble. Just slightly. Just enough that she noticed it. She pressed it flat against the table, feeling the worn formica beneath her palm, and held it there until the trembling stopped. This was what failure felt like. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just the slow, quiet understanding that the mission had been compromised, that the cover had been blown, that everything she'd been working toward had evaporated in 90 seconds of medical necessity. The window reflected back a ghost. The phone call came 3 days later. Not at the diner. Not at a hospital. Not anywhere official. It came at her apartment at 2:48 p.m. on a Tuesday, just as Margaret was folding laundry on her bed. The sound started before the knock, a low thrumming that vibrated through the floorboards, through the walls, through her chest cavity like an intruder. She walked to the window and looked down. 2 helicopters. UH-60M Blackhawks with marine markings. They were landing in the parking lot, the rotor wash sending dirt and debris and someone's trash can across the asphalt like confetti. The rotor wash hit the windows like thunder. Margaret stood frozen in her apartment, a fitted sheet suspended between her hands, the fabric billowing as the floor trembled beneath her feet. The sound was unmistakable, UH-60M Blackhawks, military designation clear in the rotational pitch, the rhythm of rotor blades that she'd heard in Helmand Province, in Kandahar, in places where the ground shook like this only when extraction was coming. She set the sheet down slowly on the couch, walked to the window, and watched 2 helicopters descend into the parking lot with the precision of apex predators landing from impossible heights. The rotors powered down. The dust settled. A full honor guard emerged, 14 Marines in dress uniforms, boots hitting the asphalt in perfect formation, their movement synchronized like a single organism. They crossed the parking lot toward her building. Margaret's hand moved to her sternum, where her heart was still beating with military discipline, and she remained completely motionless as she heard boots on the concrete stairs outside her door. 7 flights. They didn't stop. They climbed toward her. 3 sharp knocks. Military precision. She opened the door without checking the peephole. She already knew. A gunnery sergeant stood at parade rest, his uniform immaculate, his jaw set like a man delivering intelligence that would change trajectories. Behind him stood the honor guard, 13 Marines standing at attention, their eyes forward, their presence so heavy it seemed to compress the air in the hallway. "Master Chief Walsh," the gunnery sergeant asked. Not a question. A confirmation. "That's correct," Margaret said. Her voice came out calm, steady, the voice of someone who had given orders in worse conditions than a Houston apartment hallway. "We're here to escort you. General Harrison is expecting you." At Cedar Creek Medical Hospital, Dr. Whitfield was in the middle of a board meeting on the 4th floor, 300 yards away in a conference room that smelled like expensive cologne and institutional ambition. The hospital board president was reviewing quarterly metrics, surgical volume, complication rates, physician satisfaction scores, when the double doors burst open and a Marine colonel walked in, boots striking the tile floor with the same precision that had been used to climb Margaret's apartment stairs. "We need access to General Harrison's room," the colonel said. Not a request. A command. The board president stood. "Colonel, I'm not sure you understand hospital protocol." "I understand perfectly," the colonel interrupted. "We're here for Valkyrie." Whitfield's face went white. The code name hung in the air like a detonation. A second gunnery sergeant stepped forward with a tablet, and security footage began to play across the conference room screen, not of the hospital, but of Margaret moving through the parking lot, a full honor guard flanking her on both sides, the 2 Blackhawks visible in the distance with their rotors still spinning down. Within 90 seconds, Whitfield's phone was ringing. He didn't answer. He was too busy watching the footage play on loop, watching the Marines move with Margaret like she was royalty, like she was something beyond what he had dismissed as the old lady in scrubs. The Marine contingent moved to the general's room on the 3rd floor. The doors opened and Margaret stepped inside, her dress uniform impeccable, her combat boots replaced with dress shoes that had been polished to a mirror shine. The general was conscious now, sitting upright in bed, and when he saw her, his left arm moved slowly across his chest to expose a tattoo stretched across his forearm. Her name? Margaret Walsh. Letters inked in military stencil, done in Kandahar in 2010, a promise made in blood and dust and the kind of desperation that only Marines understand. "Master Chief," he said, his voice strong now, recovered. "You got me out of Marja." The board president had followed the Marines to the room. The security guard who had escorted Margaret out of the building 3 days earlier, a Navy veteran named Thompson who had spent 12 years in the surface fleet, was standing at the doorway. He went pale. His hand moved to his chest, an involuntary gesture of recognition that comes from years of understanding hierarchy. "Master Chief Petty Officer," he whispered. At ease, "Thompson," Margaret said, and her voice dropped an octave. The room heard the transformation. The timid nurse was gone. What remained was someone who had given orders in conditions that would have broken civilians. The general continued, his voice steady, his eyes locked on Margaret's. "She carried me 3 miles through a minefield. Sanjan Valley, Helmand Province. IED had taken my right leg, severed the femoral artery. She applied a tourniquet with her own hands, kept pressure on the wound while calling in air support with my radio. She moved like she knew exactly where every explosive device was buried. 40 Marines that day. 40 of us came home because of her." A colonel stepped forward with a tablet. He began reading from a military service record, his voice formal, official, the weight of institutional memory behind every word. 3 tours of duty. 17 commendations. Bronze Star. Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts. He paused. The room held its breath. And a Navy Cross. Awarded for extraordinary heroism in Marja, 2010. The silence lasted exactly 7 seconds. Then Whitfield's phone lit up. The email was from his medical school mentor, Dr. Richard Sterling, a man who had sponsored Whitfield's entire career, written letters of recommendation, introduced him to hospital boards across the region. The subject line read, "We are finished." The body was composed of 3 paragraphs. The first outlined Whitfield's conduct during morning rounds, the mockery, the condescension, the deliberate humiliation of a subordinate staff member. The second mentioned a viral video now circulating through social media, posted by a 4th-year resident, documenting his words, "Outdated nursing practices, Civil War nurse, grandma scrubs." The third paragraph was a formal statement that Dr. Sterling was disowning Whitfield publicly and demanding a full board investigation into his pattern of abusive conduct and professional negligence. The email was copied to 47 people. The board president looked at Whitfield. "Step outside," he said. Not a request. Whitfield's 15-year career began its collapse in that moment. The board would spend the next 72 hours uncovering a pattern, the complaints he'd filed against Margaret after she'd correctly identified his misdiagnosis, the security footage showing him blocking her access to patient care, the testimony of staff describing years of calculated humiliation designed to silence nurses who caught his errors, the discovery that his vaunted efficiency metrics were built on silencing voices that threatened to expose his incompetence. The Texas Board of Nursing cleared Margaret of all charges. They issued a formal apology. Cedar Creek Medical offered her full reinstatement, back pay calculated at $127,000 plus damages. She declined. Her mission parameters had changed. 6 months later, Whitfield was teaching CPR basics at a community college in southwest Houston, demonstrating chest compressions on plastic dummies named Annie, explaining hand placement to students who didn't know his name and wouldn't have cared if they did. His medical license was intact. The board had decided that administrative action was sufficient, but his professional reputation was a corpse. 43 job applications. 43 rejections. His mentor's public disavowal had made certain that no hospital in the region would touch him. The careful network of board connections, the managed optics, the 15 years of institutional climbing, all of it dissolved in 72 hours. A nursing student in the back row raised her hand during a lecture on vital signs. Why manual checks when we have monitors? Isn't technology better? Whitfield paused. His hands were on the dummy's chest, positioned for compressions. For the first time in his career, he didn't have an answer that centered himself. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Then he said, quietly, technology fails. Hands don't lie. He looked up and saw the student watching him with an expression that suggested she didn't understand that he was speaking to his own ghost. Meanwhile, Margaret stood in a closed military ceremony on a Tuesday afternoon in a chapel at Fort Sam Houston. Her dress uniform hung perfectly, tailored to Marine Corps standards, the medals arranged on her chest in ascending order of precedence. The Defense Distinguished Service Medal was pinned last, highest, the ribbon a flash of burgundy and gold. The general, fully recovered, stood beside her. The investigation into his suspicious stroke had uncovered a conspiracy. A defense contractor had attempted to silence him regarding a weapons system malfunction that had killed 4 Marines in training. The contractor had paid someone inside Cedar Creek Medical to introduce a compound into his full line designed to appear as a natural cardiac event. Margaret's undercover nursing mission, monitoring him for secondary attacks, had succeeded despite her blown cover. Her unauthorized emergency pericardiocentesis had saved his life and exposed the conspiracy. She changed back into scrubs before leaving the base. Not at Cedar Creek Medical. Her posting had changed. A veterans hospital across Houston, a facility that treated wounded warriors and aging combat veterans, a place where experience was valued and manual vitals checks were still standard protocol. Her combat boot sat in her locker again, the leather cracked and weathered, the rubber sole worn thin from 3 tours in places where concrete didn't exist. A young nurse, fresh out of her RN program, barely 24 years old, asked about the boots one afternoon. "They remind me where I came from," Margaret said. That was all. No elaboration. No story. The boots spoke their own language. The general visited monthly for follow-up care. He would sit in the chair beside the exam room window and nod at Margaret when she passed in the corridor, a greeting that contained an entire history of shared danger. They didn't talk about Marga often. They didn't need to. Marga lived in her hands, in the way her vitals checks were performed with the efficiency of someone who'd learned that speed meant survival. Marga lived in his recovery, each day better than the last, each return to function a small victory against the contractor who'd tried to erase him. In the nurses' station one morning, Margaret trained a group of new staff on manual vital sign assessment. A resident, young, confident, equipped with the certainty that technology had rendered experience obsolete, made a comment about old-school methods. Margaret's face remained expressionless. She pulled on fresh gloves, her movements precise and deliberate. She placed her fingers on the resident's wrist, feeling the radial artery, counting heartbeats, paying attention to the subtle variations that no monitor could capture. Her other hand was warm on the patient's forehead, assessing temperature, perspiration, the thousands of data points that hands could read if someone actually paid attention. "This patient has sepsis onset," she said quietly. "Temperature spike, tachycardia escalating, skin cool and clammy. Your monitor hasn't alarmed yet. But her body is telling you everything. Feel it." She guided the resident's fingers to the same artery. The resident felt it, the acceleration, the irregularity, the whisper of infection beginning its work. The resident looked up at Margaret with an expression that suggested the world had just reorganized itself. Later, alone in the supply room restocking equipment, Margaret allowed herself something rare, a small smile. She was back in the field. Boots in her locker. Mission parameters clear. Watching over those who once watched over her. That evening, before clocking out, she sat in the break room for a single moment and opened the personal journal she kept in her locker. The handwriting was military, precise, economical, the letters formed with the same discipline she applied to everything. She wrote one line, "True class is what you do when the lights go out." She closed the journal, returned it to her locker, pulled on her jacket despite the Houston heat, and walked back onto the floor to complete her shift, to finish her mission, to be exactly who she had always been, a Master Chief Petty Officer in scrubs, a guardian the hospital had dismissed and the Marines had never forgotten. The night shift stretched ahead of her. Quiet. Purposeful. Perfect. If you found this story powerful, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss another moment like this. And in the comments below, tell us, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? We'd love to hear your story. Thank you for watching.